Okay, hi, thanks very much. I'll just get my own timer on as well. So, yeah, I'm not a historian or a cultural studies scholar, really, but I am involved in this doctorate of creative arts in which I'm making a film, and the themes I'm dealing with in the film are essentially, well, I'm particularly interested in the residues of migration trauma and the influence of nostalgia on second and third generation Italian Australians. And today I'm going to start with a brief contextualisation of the Real Housewives of Melbourne, for those who don't know it. And then I'll be analysing how the show's representation of Italianness, or italianità, serves to articulate racial, cultural and geographic specificity. In particular, I'll be focusing on the last season, which just ended, which was season 4, and the show's 2 Italian-Australian contestants who did something kind of unusual in the show, in that they had sort of a strategic alliance that endured through the whole 8 episodes. And if you've seen the show, normally these alliances don't endure more than a couple of episodes because there are so many table-turning sort of moments. But I'll start with putting this show into context and going back and looking at Italians on screen. As everyone here will probably be aware, Italians were the largest non-English speaking migrant group in the 20th century to arrive in Australia, and yet their impact on screen culture was relatively insignificant. In fact, a film scholar like Leslie Speed talks about Italian-Australian film, either being by Italian Australians or about Italian Australians, was of peripheral significance, an exception being perhaps the film Looking for Alibrandi, which came out in the year 2000, the adaptation of a book by Melina Marchetta, but not made by an Italian. It was made by Kate Woods. Apart from that film, there haven't been many great big screen, and of course we can go right back to, they're a weird mob of course, but there haven't been many great big screen depictions of Italians. And Italian-Australian filmmakers, like going right back to people like Mangiamele or Pellizzari more recently, or Borgobello much more recently, have certainly not enjoyed the same sort of commercial success as Looking for Alibrandi. Italian characters do appear in films more generally, but they tend to be identified as sort of ethnic films rather than specifically Italian-Australian films. So here we're talking about films like The Wog Boy, which was written, produced and starred the Greek comic Nick Giannopoulos and co-starred the Italian-Australian Vince Colosimo. And the film scholar Adrian Martin has hypothesised that the marginality of Australians on the big screen has been exacerbated by what he calls the Australia's dominant culture and its tendency to sort of shove Italian and Greeks into a culturally homogenising category of just ethnic representation. And The Wog Boy and its sequel, in a sense, represents that tendency, very commercial films. The small screen, I think, has delivered some of the more enduring depictions of Italian Australians on screen, and this is where eventually we'll get to the Real Housewives. My favourite, and some of you will remember this, was the 24-episode TV series made by the ABC called Home Sweet Home, which was about an Italian immigrant taxi driver named Enzo Pacelli, played by John Bluthal. I think that's who I believe is Jewish, British Jewish, and so it's that long, rich tradition of Jews playing Italians on screen, and sometimes vice versa. Very good show. But the most long-running depiction of an Italian-Australian character was, of course, Kingswood Country with Lex Marinos, which was Bruno, a sitcom that ran from 79 to 84 on Network 7, and a show that pivoted, of course, around the tension between a racist Anglo-Australian patriarch, Ted Bulpit, and his Italian-Australian son-in-law, Bruno Bertolucci, or the Wog, as Ted called him. Highly offensive term for those who don't know, who might be visiting from overseas, used in Australia to refer to Southern European migrants. Now, Kingswood Country was a show that exploited, of course, Ted's prejudice for comic ends as a way to sort of ridicule Australians like him, who, as historian Michelle Arrow explains, were resistant to the shift from assimilationist policy to multiculturalism. But the days of Italians as the ethnic other on screen in scripted television seem over, which makes sense. Shows about more recent migrants like The Family Law, which depicts Chinese Australians, or Here Come the Habibs, depicting Arabs, have a right to take the place of shows like Home Sweet Home. But it is fascinating to me, and this is partly what inspired this, is how Italian Australians have reappeared on the small screen via reality TV. Now, if you've seen the recent My Kitchen Rules, we have two duos of men, Italian Australian men, competing. And at one point I was quite astounded that one of the young men in one of these duos, when confronted with the other couple, spoke to, you know, one of the other men in Italian. So it was quite a weird moment for me. And of course the Real Housewives of Melbourne, which I think is the most interesting small screen sort of appearance of Italians recently. Now, the Real Housewives of Melbourne is 4 seasons young. It premiered in 2014 on the pay TV channel Arena, and it's part of an international franchise, right? There are 14 shows in different cities, all based in different cities, but based around the lives of upper middle class women, socialites essentially. And it began on the Bravo channel in the US, and its title is a play on Desperate Housewives, which ran from 2004 to 2012. Now, in describing the key elements of the franchise, cultural critic Pia Dominguez points out that there is a racialization of the franchise. The New Jersey program orbits around Italian-American families. The New York Manhattan program is mostly white and or Jewish. The Orange County one is white. The Miami cast is white Latino, and the Atlanta program, now Atlanta in the US is the minority majority city. It's the one city in the US where blacks are in a majority. That's marked as the black version of the series. Now, Real Housewives of Melbourne is probably not as Italian as New Jersey, as the New Jersey version, but its two enduring Italian characters are Gina Liano, who we see here, and Lydia Schiavello. Significant presence in a show that has a main cast of between 6 and 8. So it's almost a third. For me, part of casting Gina and Lydia, I think, and I'm coming from Sydney, helps underscore Melbourne's credentials as Australia's most European city too, but there's an ambivalence around that because I think the show has a very culturally Anglo-Saxon sort of idea about what Italianness signifies. On the one level, it can be something desirable, synonymous with high fashion and luxury and fine food. On the other, it's vulgar and synonymous with sort of lower class, blue collar, roughness, or wogginess, which is a word we'll return to frequently. More on that later anyway. Now, Lydia and Gina essentially express their Italianness in several ways. Linguistically, of course, they use Italian words, sometimes mispronounced, as things get a little squashed by dropping them in the middle of an English sentence. At one point, she calls her dog scorreggio instead of scorreggia. There's some dialectic inflections, so that polpette becomes polpetti, which would sound to me like a sort of Sicilianization of, not in reference to meatballs, but in reference to breasts. They do not appear to speak Italian sentences in the actual show. I don't know how well they speak Italian, but their hospitality is another way that they sort of express their Italianness. So that revolves around antipasto platters. There's always this establishing shot when we go to Lydia or Gina's house where they're chowing down on this sort of stuff. And champagne. They don't sometimes they have meals, but often it's just this. The show also frames Gina and Lydia with other Italian Australians, including relatives, parents who speak with accented English, and in season 4 there's a fruit and vegetable store owner at the Paran markets at a stall called Pino's, who engages in light-hearted but quite crude banter with them, sexual innuendo involving phallic-shaped fruit and that sort of stuff. Anyway, I want to show you Lydia with her mum. I just want you to notice the biscuits because they'll come back. It's a minor detail, but this gives you a sense of, you know, the feeling in the room.
My mother and I are very close. We have this gorgeous bond. She just gets me and I get her. I don't know. She had the seance. I didn't want to go.
Seance?
Yeah.
Do they believe in those things?
I think so.
Okay.
Anyway, I didn't go because I just don't want to go down that path.
I loved my mum so much, and if anything, she would come to me without me doing all this, come around. No. How do you feel about having this dinner after all this trouble?
Well, it's very divided. There's Venus, Gina and I.
Should you have it?
Well, yeah, I do.
Como se chama?
The seance.
Did that say anything? No, it didn't.
Okay, so I should point out that in the last 2 series there's been a third Italian, or an honorary Italian, added to the mix. In season 3 it was Susan McLean, who's the daughter of Italian migrants like Gina and Lydia. In season 4 it's a woman by the name of Venus Bebani Clark. I would suggest she's a woman of colour, because she's born in Iran. I mean, these sort of categorisations I'm never very comfortable with making. But anyway, but who lived in Italy before migrating to Australia. Where is she?
My mother and I...
There she is. And so, in other words, they raised the Italian contingent to almost 50% of the core cast. And they're a gang in this last season. So as Gina sort of engages in various bitter confrontations with other cast members, Lydia and Venus show her loyalty and support. And Gina's, now I want to get to this very hot sort of incendiary incident in the climax of season 4. Gina's main nemesis as the season climax was a newcomer, a woman named Sally Bloomfield. And her aesthetic, of course, is polar opposite to Gina. It's blonde, it's skinny, it's short-haired, it's flat-shoed. All of these are things that Gina says to her at one stage, and she says it with disdain. And she says it with the same disdain she says when referring to another rival on the show, Janet Roach, a frenemy. She calls her an old drunk. And on another occasion she refers to Gamble, another frenemy, another blonde, a beer-drinking yobbo. Throughout, Gina has this real venom when she talks about alcohol abuse. A very southern Italian attitude, I think, to the drunk. Anyway, the lowest point of Sally and Gina's antipathetic relationship, but the highest dramatic point of the series occurs when Gina accuses Sally of calling her a wog bitch. This slur was not caught on camera, and it's one that Sally denies, but Lydia says she heard it. Okay, here we go. There's some language in this.
They say when you travel with someone you get to know them, and I've certainly got to know you.
Ditto, Gina. Ditto.
Can you two just work it out so we can
No,
just...
I don't want to work
There's
it out.
nothing to work out. Up until that night, Gina and I had no issue.
Until you called me a bully. That is an issue, darling.
Oh, you annihilate people on a daily basis and...
Listen to you. You called me a wog bitch.
This is our next level. Next level.
I was there, and I said you were there, and we looked at each other, and you went, "Oh, that's not
And I
cool
said
at
to you,
all."
don't say that. Do you recall?
I never said that, and the two of you know it.
Gina knows it's bullshit. Lydia knows it's bullshit. They're just two dumbasses.
Yes, because we're both liars, because we're wogs, aren't we?
I don't believe it.
What, you think I'd come up with something as basic as wog
Yeah,
bitch
to get
from
back.
her?
Maybe, yeah.
You cannot really hold to your
Why
heart.
are you putting it back on me? She called me
asking
something
you a
and
question.
took me back to when I was 12. Because women like her,
Oh, here we
girls
go.
at the time, spoke to me like that. It took me back to them.
Okay, so expressions of anger, of course, are very much part of the appeal of this genre of TV. Cultural critic Pierre Dominguez again labels it doco soap. A documentary with soap opera dramatic patterns. And writing about the Real Housewives of Atlanta, he says the performance and representations of anger, envy, and other forms of affect that are coded as feminine and or low class, such as jealousy and unwarranted pride, and that reproduce gendered racial imaginaries, such as the figure of the black angry woman, are expected by doco soap viewers. And I'd argue that Gina is the angry Italian woman in this, just like Teresa Giudice is the angry Italian woman in New Jersey. But interesting, I think you'll agree. I think it's possible to argue that whether or not Sally called her a wog bitch, Gina's anger suggests that things have not moved on terribly far from the days of Bruno the Wog in Kingswood Country. But I'd like to point out that the series begins, just in case you're doubting all of this, the series begins with another, it's a jokey comment, but another one of Gina's frenemies, Gamble, joking about Gina's father's funeral in the first episode of season 4, suggesting that Italians like Gina might not be averse to putting a fruit platter or spaghetti on the coffin. It's said in a jokey way, but ugh. It's also possible that Gina's reaction to the wog bitch incident was a cynical ploy to elicit sympathy from the audience. A significant number of the audience, obviously, she relies upon for her business side ventures. So here's a shot of her. Sorry, here's a shot of her site. She has her own perfume. She has her own memoir called My Way. She sells all sorts of things. There's Lydia's. Notice the biscotti. So her italianita, well, I'd say Gina's italianità is not something just imposed on her by the editing of the show, but it's a kind of key to her own story, the way she tells her own story. In 2015, by the way, she gave an interview for the Australian's Weekend magazine, and she described her look like this. In Melbourne, it translates as drag queen. But in Italy, my look is considered Sophia Loren. My style is very European. I feel most at home in Italy. Most women there look like me. So there are presumptions and assertions in those words that I don't have time to unpack. I'm not the best person to unpack them. But it's a particularly forthright and confident self-appraisal of a woman, a daughter of migrants. Look, in the time I've got left, my title for this is Familiar Yet Different. And so far, I think I've talked a lot about how things are kind of familiar to a lot of you. But the question of whether Italians are truly white or something else, or not quite white or ethnic white, has been a significant subject of research. And given the lens of whiteness studies has become such an important tool for analysing race and power hierarchies in Western societies, it's interesting to observe how Gina and Lydia have interacted with women of colour, and how women of colour kind of don't exist anymore in the 4th episode. In seasons 2 and 3, Lydia and her Filipino maid, Joanna, feature as a separate plot line. Lydia plays very much the condescending boss. It's a jokey thing, but frequently making insensitive comments. And in Ep 8, season 2, they both travel to the Philippines, and Lydia tells Joanna's mum that she's my daughter in Australia. She's family because she knows so much about my life. She jokes about stealing her passport so she can't escape and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of terrible. And there was one reviewer who criticised the show for its uncritical depiction of what it called Lydia's quote-unquote white privilege. Now, in the same episode, Gina actually sits down at a restaurant, this is the last clip, with her Sri Lankan frenemy Petite Fleur, and points out to her that her sense of humour falls flat and that she has an accent.
It can come as a real shock when someone holds up a mirror to you and says, look, this is how you're behaving.
You have to stop saying things. You have to stop saying things about Gamble. I suffer the same thing with my sense of humour.
I'm quick-witted. That's it. That's all I am.
But not everyone thinks you're quick-witted. You think that.
Sometimes it might not even sound like,
Wit. Because you say it too straight-faced and you've got an accent. You're not a comedian.
So what I find interesting there is that the assumed role that both Gina and Lydia started to adopt in that season 2, season 3 was of cultural gatekeeper, this notion of you have an accent, and it also reflects a kind of disturbing notion that experiencing racism in one's life doesn't necessarily make you empathetic, which is something that Helen Andreoni, in her research of Italian Australians, and Pauline Hanson in the 1990s, found out a lot about. So it's worth noting that neither the maid, Joanna, or Petite Fleur, and I'm finishing up now, have returned in season 4. And I think the reason for that is that, season 4 is a season in which Italianness, italianità, has emerged stronger than ever as an ethnic other. And my feeling is the presence of women in colour in previous seasons opened up racial and cultural tensions on too many fronts, demanded a sophistication from the show that the show couldn't accommodate. Of course, I'd argue there is a woman of colour in season 4, and it is the Iranian-born Venus. But her status as staunch ally of Gina and therefore Lydia, not to mention her own Italian connection of being brought up in Italy for a certain period of her childhood, and a kind of simpatico, as they say in English, with Italian culture. In one episode, she wears a glitzy dress with the words "I love you" in Italian emblazoned on it, "Ti voglio bene," big red. It seems for now that, so it makes a different proposition for women of colour, I think, and it seems that Gina and Lydia's performance of Italian identity tends to eclipse and neutralise other ethnic identities within the show, and I think this often happens, and there's, I think, a lot of resentment towards Italian diasporas is often based around this perception that they suck the oxygen out of the pop culture room. Scorsese has a big, The Sopranos, there's too many, So, but I think the persistence, and for example, Jackie Gillies, herself a migrant born in Croatia, is barely identified in the show as anything other than white. So look, the persistence of Italian-Australian identity is something in tension with white Anglo-Australian identity, whatever we want to call it, is fascinating, I think. And I think more than 30 years after Bruno the Wog from Kingswood Country disappeared from screens, I think Italian-Australians are still dealing with the W word and its legacy, and whether that word was uttered in season 4 or whether it simply reverberates inside their heads, I don't think it matters, actually. Thank you.